Zalizer Radio 96.1 FM. Don't miss out. Your sex education journey starts this Tuesday with Roma as your guide.
Welcome to another episode of Pleasure Pulse. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and I'm so happy that you are joining me for another Tuesday, another interesting and exciting conversation about sex-related topics. As usual, before I get into the meat of today's discussion, I like to take a short break so that you can let everybody know that Pleasure Pulse is live and that everybody should tune in. So we'll take a short break and then we'll come right back and start tonight's conversation. Welcome back. You're tuned in to Pleasure Pulse and I'm your host, Roma Richardson. You're listening to ZIZ on Facebook, on YouTube, or you're watching on Facebook and YouTube, and you're listening on ZIZ Radio 96.1. And I'm so happy for us to be here, to be in this space for another conversation about sex. And I'm here solo tonight, and I was like, okay, so if I'm doing this solo, why not talk about one of those solo sex topics? So tonight, we're talking about masturbation. By the way, today is International Men's Day. Happy International Men's Day. I hope that all of the men feel called in to talk about, to reflect on their position when it comes to gender equality, when it comes to making their lives and the lives of women and girls and everybody else better. I hope that today you take the time to reflect on how you can do better at caring for yourself and caring for the people around you. So, happy International Men's Day. Tonight we're talking about solo sex, which is otherwise called masturbation. And in this, hopefully, well, actually, why I say hopefully, because it's just me, so I can be as candid as and honest as I want. But in tonight's conversation, we will get into the world of self-pleasure, and we will discuss some of the taboos, some of the myths around masturbation, and we will hopefully by the end of it be able to think a little bit differently, if we're not already like fully open and accepting of it, about masturbation. So there are lots of sides, and lots of angles that we could talk about masturbation from. Tonight, I want to talk about, of course, what masturbation is, a reminder for those who already know, and a definition for those who might not be so familiar. There might be some misconceptions about what it is. We'll talk about some of its benefits. We'll look at some cultural and historical views, some social views around masturbation, including taboos. We'll talk about pleasure and self-care. We'll look at some of the myths or misconceptions, and then, of course, I'll end with some tips. And that's me outlining it and hoping that we get through all of it tonight. So let's get really straight into it. I think masturbation is something that, well, sex on a whole, and it's been repeated on the show, is a very taboo topic. It's not something that we talk about, even though all of us are here as a result of sex, except Jesus. And though all of us, most of us at some point will engage in sexual activity. Masturbation is similar in that a lot of people do it. A lot of people feel shame when it comes to talking about it. And that's something that needs to change, because just like partnered sex, masturbation is a very normal sexual activity. So hopefully we can move towards normalizing it as such. So what's masturbation? Masturbation is the stimulation, often manual, of the genitals for sexual gratification. And I got that definition from Psychology Today. It is also a natural act of self-exploration, of pleasure. And as I mentioned earlier, it's often stigmatized. There are often lots of taboos around it. And it's something that is can be very highly misunderstood, especially when it comes to the gendered dimensions of masturbation. Now, masturbation has a lot of benefits, and I think there were like a few shows, actually more than a few, couple shows ago, when I was talking about sex toys, and you can of course access that show in the Pleasure Pulse playlist on YouTube. We talked about masturbation because a lot of that conversation was around self-pleasure, and we talked about some of the benefits of masturbation, and I think it also came up in other conversations. Masturbation has benefits that range from mental to physical, as well as, interpersonal and social. First of all, masturbation feels good. This is Pleasure Pulse, and so one of the things that we center here is pleasure. Masturbation feels good, full stop. And that's whether it's solo or mutual masturbation. So you can masturbate alone, like just by yourself in your own company, or there can be, multiple people who are self-pleasuring but are in the same space, or you can help your partner masturbate, right? And why it feels good is that it releases dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins, which are those feel-good chemicals. So if you've ever masturbated, a lot of people, some people masturbate like before they go to work. Some people masturbate before they are going to do anything that they need to be in a good mood for, because it helps that mood. I was reading this article, and the person started out by saying it was a woman. They were like, they masturbated 3 times before work because that was the push that they need to go through their day feeling good. So masturbation feels good and helps to release those feel-good chemicals. It also helps to reduce stress and anxiety. So sometimes people are like everything is on me. I just can't deal with this. I need to, as they say colloquially, rub one out. I hope that was okay to say. Jedi said, well, let me know if it wasn't. But it helps to reduce stress and anxiety. Like, it helps to calm the nerves. It helps to put the body in a relaxed state, which also is why it can improve sleep quality. So a lot of people also masturbate before bed because they feel like masturbating helps them to have a better night's sleep. So masturbation is good for sleep quality. It also helps with more intimate relationships. So I was reading again, articles about it, and some studies have found that at least in women, there's a positive correlation between the frequency of masturbation and the frequency of intercourse, like with other people. So it seems as if people who masturbate more are more sexually driven. And this kind of makes sense because I've heard a couple women say that sex, or describe sex as very like out of sight, out of mind. So in sight, in mind. So masturbation and mutual masturbation especially can help to increase the frequency and variety of sexual contact with others. So if you are, in a relationship, or you're in a throuple, or whatever it is, and you are realizing that the frequency of sex maybe isn't what it's used to, or you're going through a period of like no sex for a while and you're trying to figure out how to get back into it, maybe masturbation can be a good opportunity to ease yourselves like back into the frame of mind of sex, and also help you to regain that contact. Masturbation can also help you understand your sexual desires. Like, it can help you understand what you like because it's exploring your body. It can help you understand what feels good and maybe what doesn't feel good. And so when you do that, you're able to better direct your partner, better talk to your partner about those sexual desires. And in that way, it also helps you learn a lot about each other. So you become better at pleasuring each other through pleasuring yourself and learning what works for you. Remember, communication is one of the C's that I always mention here, because closed mouths don't get fed. Who don't ask don't get. Like, it's important for you to be able to articulate what your needs are. And on the other side, it means that there has to be that space and that safety for people to articulate their needs, to clarify their needs, to let you know, or to give you feedback, to let you know, okay, not quite this, I prefer this instead, and like this, you know, with this amount of pressure, this amount of intensity, this speed, and so on. Exploring your body and learning how to give yourself sexual pleasure can be empowering, and it can help you with your own body image. I feel like, especially for women, and you know, I will bring this back up later in the conversation, but especially for women and people who have been either shamed about their bodies or who feel like insecurities about their bodies, masturbation can help you to connect with it, to understand what's there and understand how things work, understand what you like, and it can also therefore like enhance how you project yourself to the world and how you know, how you show up in sexual spaces. Masturbation is also safer, so there's a lower likelihood of transmitting STDs, and I say a lower likelihood because, you know, you still have to be careful about toys that might be shared and things like that. There's definitely a lower likelihood of becoming pregnant, you know, through masturbation. Some sources suggest that masturbation in men may improve motility or movement of sperm, and in some research, masturbation is also correlated with boosting the immune system. So perhaps the next time you have a cold, instead of reaching for vitamin C, you can reach for your sex toy. I'm not a doctor, that's just my irresponsible sexual advice, but you know, you can consider it. Now, when it comes to sexual health, as I mentioned, you know, masturbation can help to encourage open dialogue about pleasure in partnered relationships. So when you're in a relationship with somebody or somebodies, it can help you to be more comfortable and be more open talking about masturbation, especially if both of you or everybody involved is a fan of masturbation. Now, I started out by saying masturbation is a very normal thing. You know, some people masturbate often, some people don't masturbate as much, and some people don't masturbate at all. But it's something that lots of people do, including children and teenagers, right? So masturbation is not one of those things that is necessarily hurting anyone. Of course, we're not talking about doing masturbation in non-consensual ways. Consent, of course, is always part of the conversation. So we're not talking about masturbating in public. We're not talking about exposing yourself to other people who are not interested in seeing that, right? So when it comes to children, especially children who are just like actually really just new and feeling around and finding things and realizing that some things feel good to them and so on, there are of course age appropriate ways to talk to your children and talk to your teenagers about masturbation, you know, to encourage them. Well, first of all, you don't want to shame them about it because you don't want people to shut down or feel, you know, begin to feel disgust towards their bodies or towards pleasure, because that might also be their takeaway. But the conversation centers around appropriate spaces and times for masturbation. So like, do it in the confines of your bedroom or a private space, a bathroom if they don't have their own bedroom, things like that. So I encourage you to, if you especially notice it around children, to, well, there's a lot that could be happening, right? But you want to have a conversation about it to make sure that it's coming from a place of just inquisitiveness and not a place of previous harm or present and ongoing harm. So you want to be able to talk to them about it to ensure that it is coming from a safe space, and that children and teenagers know how to approach masturbation and are able to enjoy the benefits of it that I mentioned earlier. There are a lot of cultural views and historical views about masturbation, and I'm also including religious views as part of this conversation, right? So like, I feel like the majority of people here grew up in the church, grew up Christian, and especially if you grew up in a church like the Catholic Church, masturbation is a sin, and in other churches it's talked about, I feel like, for the most part, as a sin as well. And it's interesting to me, and this is just a side note, that there are so many churches that have separated from traditional or orthodox churches to create their own identities, where they become more strict about those like original kinds of beliefs and practices. That's just interesting to me, and become like more committed to condemnation and so on. And I think in general, especially as masturbation is for the most part, or can be, a very safe and beneficial way to practice solo pleasure, churches have to evolve, and churches have to consider how their dictates are perhaps causing more harm than they are helping, right? So some religious doctrines have influenced a lot of shame and have contributed to a lot of the shame around masturbation and around sex in general. At the same time, I think that culturally, there's a lot more openness to talk about masturbation, to make jokes about masturbation, to create media, and to put masturbation in TV shows and content around masturbation and so on. So like sex education, for example, and I think I've mentioned that show before. That's like a resource that I want to keep mentioning to people, especially while it is still on Netflix. It's a really good resource for people who are learning about sex, and all of us are still learning about it, right? Like sex is one of those things where you continue learning about it. So there's that increased openness in media and so on to talk about it. But of course, there are some spaces in society that are more open to conversations than other spaces. And so the move for a lot of us should be to get the majority of us, if not everybody, to a space of comfort when talking about these topics and honesty. Like how do we get to be able to talk honestly about the things that bring us pleasure in families, in schools? How are we able to talk with our peers about self-pleasure in productive ways, in honest ways, in light ways, in joking ways that still really honor the core feelings and benefits and so on about masturbation? And of course, there are those taboos and there's the shame that surrounds masturbation, and it often comes from misinformation, but it also comes from how we are conditioned to view masturbation. And the views about masturbation sometimes differ depending on the gender, depending on the body that the person has. But of course, breaking these taboos can help us to foster healthier attitudes towards not just masturbation, but sexuality in general. We're going to take a short break right here. I want to give you a minute or two to think about some of the taboos that you've heard about masturbation, to think about how you have been shamed when it's come to masturbation and the ways that you practice self-pleasure. So think about that, discuss that in your small spaces, and then we'll come back and continue the conversation. Welcome back. That was probably not a long enough break for you, but of course, the conversations should continue after Pleasure Pulse. Like, we're just here for an hour. So between the hours that we're here every Tuesday and I'm not good at maths, 23 hours times 6, 7 that you are, on your own. I hope that you are really finding time to continue these conversations, to bring up things, to refer to old shows and be like, let's watch this again, to talk about how we feel about things, because I'm really curious to know how you feel about it and how a lot of these things have affected your own sexual life and your own perception of yourself. So we're talking about masturbation, and we've discussed some of the benefits of masturbation. We've also talked about some of the cultural views, religious views around masturbation, and how in cultures some of them are becoming a lot more progressive, inclusive, and modern. And yet the taboos and some of the shame and so on persist, right? So we are thinking about how we can challenge and break those taboos and remove the shame from masturbation. That, I think, we should all get to a point of agreeing is a very normal human activity. But I want to shift into pleasure and self-care. Pleasure as a concept is still finding its way into conversations about sex and into sex education. If you grew up, when I grew up, or you grew up before I grew up, I'm not even sure what the conversations on sex ed are in school now, but if you grew up in my generation now, earlier, that the education that we got about sex was basically about risk. So it was about risk avoidance. It was about, it was about keeping ourselves safe, but it wasn't really framed like keeping ourselves and others safe. It was framed as in a negative way. So it was a lot about what not to do, and the only thing that was available to us to do was to abstain from sex. So it's and abstaining is still a kind of negative, don't do sex, but the conversations never went into pleasure. I don't remember talking about masturbation in an honest and uplifting and encouraging way. I think the conversations were very much anything you do when it comes to your genitals will result in you getting pregnant or getting an STD. And that was the extent of the sex education. And so for pleasure now to be making its way into conversations about sex is a huge departure from that that way of approaching it, or that paradigm. And it has also been a huge opportunity, because focusing on the reason that people have sex in the first place, because it feels good, helps to set a more honest and positive baseline for these conversations. So pleasure is an important part of who we are as humans, and it's an important part of why we do a lot of the things that we do. We have sex because it feels good. We exercise because it feels good. We spend time with people we love and we care about because it feels good. We are activists and we fight for rights because that feels good. We participate in climate justice because that feels good. We advocate for all sorts of things because that feels good. And so when we start to think of pleasure as a key, and recognize it, as a key motivating factor, and use that lens to talk about potential risks, we are better placed, to have those conversations. So pleasure and self-pleasure is a part of self-care. There's lots of, concern about the guilt that's associated with self-pleasure and also self-care, with the shame, with how we can sometimes become over-reliant on a particular activity that feels good, sometimes because we are escaping something else, right? So there are also things to look out for as you begin or continue your masturbation journey, right? So when we talk about looking at masturbation as a form of self-care, just as you light your candles and you cozy up in bed or in your tub or wherever with a nice book or whatever it is, you can see masturbation as one of those acts that can help you to care for yourself, to release those feel-good hormones, to help with your sleep, to help you rest, right? It's also a really good way to take control of your own pleasure. It's an excellent way to learn about your body and learn what you like, but it's also a lot of people masturbate because they know exactly how they like things. No one can please them the way that they can please themselves, and that's completely valid and completely understandable. I remember when I was doing my research on sexual agency, which included pleasure, somebody talked about, after having partnered sex, going off to masturbate because the sex was disappointing, and they knew just what they needed to do to be able to have an orgasm, right? So it's a really empowering way in instances like that, and just regularly, to take control of your own pleasure. It's also, as I mentioned, I talked about body image and so on, but it helps to build body positivity and self-confidence. You can learning about your body can help you appreciate it more. And of course, when it comes to guilt and shame, especially in religious context, but also otherwise, because people do have a lot of myths and misconceptions about masturbation, it is key for you to offer us to normalize self-pleasure as a personal choice. There's not something right or wrong about it. It's just something that people choose to do or choose not to do, right? And of course, I'm saying again, aside from the conversations about consent and doing it in private and so on, right? So we need to be able to normalize self-pleasure as a personal choice. And of course, when it comes to addressing that guilt and shame, you can remind yourself that masturbation does benefit you. I'm sure you have experienced benefits of masturbation beyond the list that I've given. And I would encourage you to, to do your own research on your own body. Like, see how your sleep is the nights when you masturbate. See how you feel the next day when you masturbate. Like, see for yourself what those benefits have been, and then you can decide if it's something worth continuing, if something worth like playing around. Sorry, playing around more with. And as I mentioned, myths and misconceptions, let's talk about some of those, because there are quite a few. And I would also love you to tell me some of the myths and misconceptions that you've heard about masturbation, especially here in our small society. What are the things what were the things that you were told, whether that's in church, in school, by your parents, by people in the community? What are the things you heard in passing? A lot of times we're passing, and men are, particularly men, are having conversations about all sorts of things. Like, have you ever heard them talk about what happens when you masturbate? I'm really curious in knowing, like, kitchen and division wise, what are some of the myths that we have either created ourselves or perpetuated. So one myth is that masturbation causes health problems, and I asked someone, what are some of the myths that you heard about masturbation? And she said that it makes you go blind, and especially men, it makes men go blind. And so I was like, I think I heard about it like a long time ago, probably in school, where among young people who, like, where there are gaps in information, they're filling information from wherever sources. People like spew things like that, including that it makes you go blind. Here's a fact: masturbation does not make you go blind. In fact, masturbation is a safer method usually than partnered sex, and it is healthy. There's also a myth that only single people masturbate, or only people who are not able to have sex with other people masturbate, when actually, and I've talked about mutual masturbation a lot, people in relationships masturbate as well. And you could masturbate in front of each other. Sometimes people masturbate privately. People have phone sex. People video call each other and are masturbating on the phone. So people in relationships masturbate too. And nothing is wrong with masturbating while you're in a relationship. I think that's another part of the conversation. I don't even know if it's not even a myth, right? It's like social conditioning. It's like things what we've been taught to feel and think about sex, that if you are, or if you have a partner, any sex that you have that is not with that partner, and I mean that you have by yourself, or any enhancements that you use like toys and so on, affect by default negatively the relationship, when none of that is true. Everything depends on how things are done, how open people are in the relationship, whether or not somebody is actually masturbating to avoid sex with their partner, which will require, necessitate another type of conversation. So single people are not the only ones who masturbate. People in relationships masturbate, and as I said, they can masturbate alone, like in private, without the knowledge, or perhaps with the knowledge of their partner, or they can masturbate in the same space as their partner, and that is completely fine. There's also a myth that masturbation is only for men. And it's a really interesting myth because while some studies suggest that men masturbate more, women also masturbate. And I think it connects to the conversation about like sex drives, like the idea that men's sex drives are higher than women, and the research that has gone into show that maybe in some instances they're higher, but maybe not by that much. And if we're talking about those differences, is it more worthwhile to talk about why those differences appear than just the differences themselves? Because I think we need to refrain from like repeating the idea that men are these sex driven creatures unable to control themselves, who are just like motivated by sex, who don't care about love and intimacy and connection, because it doesn't help anybody. So yeah, like while some studies might suggest that men masturbate more, women masturbate too. And there are women I know, there are women we've seen on TV, there are women who have talked about it publicly, like about their sex toy drawer. So it's like, we know that women masturbate. They have entire drawers next to their beds for just their sex toys. But it's about like the social expectations when it comes to sex. Like men are more able to talk about lots of things. Like men are more able to talk about their penises. Men are more able probably to talk about masturbation because the conversation will be delivered in such a way that, like, I don't know, like usually it's about, I problematically looked at this thing, and it's often like centered around this subjecting women and the objectification of women. But like, I don't want to go there. But like, oftentimes men are more able to like have conversations like these, when I'm more encouraged to talk about anything in private and public spaces. So women are less likely to have those conversations usually because women are less encouraged to have those conversations. When it comes to sex, women are expected to be more passive. So how does passivity and taking charge of your sexual self through consistent self-pleasure live together in harmony? Usually not. So because of like that expectation that women will be passive when it comes to sex and when it comes to talking about sex, otherwise if they talk about sex, that means that they're just up and on the place, women are less likely to discuss it openly. And so that contributes to some of those like differences in reporting and differences in practice, because there's a lot of stigma around female sexuality that also affects women's masturbation practices. In fact, a lot of women actually, I think societally, and that will allow for recognizing, the differences in individual families and so on. But societally, we are taught to hate vulvas and vaginas, and women are taught to hate them too. So there's very little encouragement to be like, yeah, look at yourself. I mean, there are those whole classes and sections in curricula where it's like encouraging you to take a mirror and look at yourself. Those are usually for women and people with vaginas, right? So women are taught to hate their genitals, and that affects how they self-pleasure. So it is moving from those very limiting conversations to ones that will allow for people to explore sexual pleasure in its full range, including self-pleasure, that can help us to have more productive and honest and helpful conversations. And then another myth is that, people will become addicted to masturbation. And of course, like any behavior, masturbation, can become overdone. So you want to be looking out for whether or not masturbation is disrupting your daily habits and rituals. If you are reaching to work late because you are masturbating, if you're forgetting to pick up your children because you are masturbating, if you stop going to church because you're masturbating. So like anything that disrupts especially your daily operations and your relationships with others should be looked at with like a critical, an honest, a reflective eye. But of course, anything in moderation, everything in moderation. So moderate self-pleasure is healthy. How often is too often? Of course, it depends on you. Like I said, paying attention to whether or not it has interfered with your daily practices and the expectations that people have of you. If it doesn't disrupt your daily life and you're able to continue with things as usual, another myth is that it will affect your ability to enjoy sex with a partner. Absolutely, let me not say absolutely, not true. Not true by default, right? It can enhance your sexual relationship by improving self-awareness. On the other side, it might become a thing where like I prefer to have sex with my hand, as men say with Miss Palmer, than to have sex with my partner. And I think if the interest is, or if the intention is to continue with that relationship and both of you want to have sex in the relationship, that requires a conversation and some honesty about maybe how things can be done differently, how you can use some of those things that really work for you when you're self-pleasuring in partnered sex, how your partner can help you to achieve some of those same feelings. And finally, I want to finish with some tips when it comes to masturbation. So the recommendation is that you use this hand. That's just a joke. I don't know if anybody's laughing. Not those kinds of tips. These tips come from Planned Parenthood and they have to do with safety, keeping yourself safe, being able to, or making sure that you are fully able to enjoy the moment by reducing exposure to STDs and so on. So, and other types of bacteria, because of course, don't just come from outside and be like, let me go touch myself, especially if you do have a partner and there might be some partnered sex after the masturbation, right? You want to ensure that you are practicing proper hygiene so that you don't give yourself like any bacteria or so on, and that you also don't pass it on to your partner. So of course you want to wash your hands properly before touching your penis, your vulva, your vagina, or your anus. You want to use a good lubricant. If you don't need it, the point is just to ensure that the friction is reduced so that you can reduce small tears and so on. So you want to ensure that you are properly lubricated. You want to clean your sex toys if you use sex toys, otherwise bacteria can build up and cause an infection, especially if you're a person with a vagina where everything can cause an infection and throw you off, right? And if you are practicing masturbation, or if you're masturbating with a partner and you are sharing sex toys, our recommendation is to use a condom that you change with each person, right? Or as you pass from one body opening to another. For example, you might use it in your mouth, you might use it in your vagina, you might use it in your anus, you might use it in a mix of those among folks. So you want to change, the condom each time. And if you don't use condoms, you want to make sure that you are cleaning sex toys properly, like before and after every use. And of course, clean your sex toys according to the instructions that were given. So some of them can't be submerged in water, some of them can be, so just pay attention to how you are advised to clean your toys. And as I mentioned, you don't want to share sex toys with more than one person without cleaning or using new condoms each time, or there is the risk of passing along STDs. So I just want to remind you, that masturbation is about pleasure, but it's not just about pleasure. It's mostly about pleasure, but there are lots of other benefits. And let me not say it's mostly about pleasure, because of course you have lots of reasons for doing it. But one of those reasons is pleasure. But masturbation is also a really good way of helping you to learn about yourself. And if you are in a relationship, that knowledge that you get about yourself can be really great for sharing with partners and enhancing that intimacy and that connection that you have with each other. So while you are doing this self-exploration to better understand your body and to make yourself feel good, it can also have that ripple effect of improving your relationships with other people. And what more can you ask for? I feel like that's the goal, right? And anything that can help us get to that goal of self-pleasure, of pleasure, of enjoying each other, of enjoying ourselves, of feeling good in the spaces that we are in, of loving our bodies, of showing up well and fully and wholly to spaces and being loved and appreciated and accepted fully in those spaces. And the idea that masturbation can help us to get to that place is just it's just such a low-hanging fruit, right? You don't need any big prep or anything. You don't need to agree with anybody on a time. There's so much that is in your control when it comes to masturbation. You can set the mood however you want. And I just encourage you tonight. Okay, it doesn't have to be tonight. It could be tomorrow. It could be the next week. It could be next week. It could be whenever. But I just encourage you to, if you still have some hesitance about masturbation, continue reading about it. Do some research about it. Follow sex education pages that talk about masturbation and see what tips they are sharing. See how they can allay some of your fears. And I encourage you, if you feel like it, to flick the pin, to self-pleasure. I encourage you to do that. And I'm so happy as at the beginning and at the end that you joined me for tonight's conversation on masturbation. And I hope that you can continue talking about these topics. And more than that, I hope that you have a pleasurable evening. And I will see you all next time. Bye.
Get ready to ignite your Tuesday nights with a show that's as educational